Aloha everyone, it's Ajanette and I am here to talk about sexual orientation, sometimes referred to as sexuality as I might describe it. When we're talking about sexuality, I think your chapter opens talking about penguins having same-sex relationships. And so that references comparative psychology. Comparative psychology is where we study animals and we compare the behavior and patterns observed among animals and relate that to human behavior. And so penguins are one type of animal that does engage in same-sex relationships. I did read an article from the National Geographic recently, and they indicated that same-sex animal relationships have explicitly been excluded from the literature and from the research, and so consequently it might be far more common than is realized or addressed because we bring our bias into how we're interpreting animal behavior as well, or just the focus areas for our research. And it has historically been left out of the research studies. And so there is a current movement to focus specifically on more diverse behavior and trying to study that and understand its relationship and connection to human behavior. So when we're talking about orientation, we're really talking about attraction, right? And that can be sexual or romantic attraction. Sexual is related to intercourse, and romantic is more related to the emotional intimacy and connection. And you can have one or both, right? And some of the more common identities are outlined here. We're going to expose you to some other terminology that you likely have been exposed to through, or that you were exposed to through the Safe Zone training as well. But queer is more of an umbrella term, a reclaimed term that we utilize now. Bisexual is a bit problematic because it kind of implies that binary gender and sex, and that becomes problematic, right? So that perpetuation of that binary definition is a problem, and it excludes individuals that might have more gender expansive identities. So pansexual is a little bit more, expansive in that it really is just talking about an identity that is not limited to just man or woman, right? So I have heard some people describe themselves as bisexual when they're attracted to two or more or two different gender identities. That's not always in a binary category. So that is also another way that I've had members of the community identify to think about as well. Polyamorous is poly being multiple, right? So it's a relationship where you can have multiple consensual. Now, your book talks about monogamous relationships. Within a polyamorous relationship, they can be monogamous within that relationship. There may be more than two parties in that relationship, but it's still monogamous within that relationship. So the notion that all polyamorous relationships are open or non-exclusive, I really don't like that definition. So heads up, it can be 3 or more people engaged in a very consensual, committed relationship to one another, where they're not engaging in sexual or romantic interactions with people outside of that consenting group. And sometimes, a polyamorous relationship can also be like, I have a relationship with you, I have a relationship with this person, but they don't necessarily have a relationship with each other, but they know about each other, right? So they're both part of that consenting polyamorous notion, but I'm not out just being with whomever, right? Asexual, A is typically like the absence, and asexual, aromantic also is another descriptor. Sometimes, somebody that identifies as asexual, they can still be in a romantic coupled relationship, same-sex or otherwise, but they may not be engaging in sexual relationships or have a desire to engage in sexual relationships, or maybe they have decided amongst their partnership how they want to manage that. Very private decision, right? And that's something they negotiate with one another. Definitely not a question that you should be asking, right? Again, respect the diversity of the identity, respect the personal nature of the identity, and then respect the privacy of the intricate details. Alfred Kinsey was one of the first to really present scientific research that looked at measuring sexuality on a continuum versus the binary perspective that has been so heavily focused on. And his research actually revealed some really interesting patterns. So he had you, and this illustrates it over here to the right, you were rating your results indicated that you were either 0 to 6 in terms of your sexuality, with exclusively heterosexual on one end of the continuum and exclusively homosexual on the other end of the continuum. And his notion is that it's not categorical. We're not fully homosexual, fully heterosexual, fully pansexual, right? That we score on a continuum. That's why I identify as mostly heterosexual. I did have that one encounter where I met a woman at a conference who aroused me in ways that I had never experienced before from a woman. And so, I'm very cognizant that I am mostly heterosexual, right? I've never had a relationship with a woman, but clearly there was that one woman that sparked something in me that I had never had sparked before. So I would probably lean toward the heterosexual scoring, but not entirely. Kinsey's research also, thousands of participants also revealed that there was greater sexual variance than what society assumed and what we continue to probably presume and stereotype, especially among bisexual individuals. So there was a much higher rate of bisexuality reported than was previously understood or expected. And specifically, women were more likely to report a bisexual identity than men. So that was really interesting. And when you're talking about looking at sexuality and identity on a continuum, right, that is in fact an example of social constructionism. So social constructionism, when we're talking about a social constructionist theory, we're really talking about this notion that we develop social constructs such as gender, sex, right? They're artificial. Money is a social construct, right? We as a society assert value and we define the terms and conditions and rules around that construct. So we have come up with a concept of gender, and we have defined it and categorized it and determined who's in what category and what's the criteria by which they're assigned to what category, right? So how many categories, all of that. We've done the same with race, class, ability, and sexuality, right? So they're not inherently biological, right? They are also influenced by the social meaning that's assigned to them. So ultimately, they're products, they're things that we create and interpret and shape. Now, there is some criteria to think about when you're talking about social constructivism. And Jonathan Katz actually has talked about, he's a historian that's researched conceptions of heterosexuality throughout American history. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, we often think of, the modern ways in which we define and support the LGBTQ community, it's often thought to be new, contemporary. And that's actually not always the case, right? So we operate from a very what we call heteronormative perspective, where we assume heterosexuality is the norm and any variations thereof is abnormal. And that's kind of the general message of society, American society. We're talking about US right now, right? And Jonathan Katz actually, as a historian, went back to primary sources and talked about the invention of heterosexuality as it is conceived today in the late 1990s, where if you look at historically, heterosexual was actually a term that was used to describe more deviant sexuality rather than what is perceived as normal today. It was used to describe individuals who were somewhat bisexual, attracted to both sexes, and who engaged in sex not just for reproductive purposes, but also pleasure. Obviously, the way in which we use the term now is drastically different, right? And because it is evolving, right, that is an example of social construction. Like that evolution of the way in which the term is used and sexuality is defined is in fact evidence for this notion of social constructivism of these concepts rather than them being innately biological. As I mentioned, money is a social construct, right? That paper in your wallet means nothing, right? Until we as a society assign the value to that and agree to the terms and conditions by which we're going to exchange it or allow it to somehow have a value that allows you to acquire, concrete items and commodities. And so that is a primary example of something that's been socially constructed. Gender, same thing. Sexuality, same thing, right? So there's kind of this process or these conditions that are met that support this notion of social constructivism. But overall, when something is a social construct, it means that we as a society hold kind of this collective belief system and rules around a particular concept, right? So things to consider are social construction changes within institutions. So when you start to see, for instance, the healthcare system defining heterosexuality differently than it did, 50 years ago, that is a reflection of that constructivist nature, right? When society is viewing sexuality differently, right? Like compared to the 1950s, compared to now, the level of support and acceptance for the LGBTQ community, particularly white gay males, is significantly higher than it was 70 years ago. When you see those cultural and historical, contexts influencing how we're defining, understanding, accepting, supporting those concepts, like at one point in time, like the Victorian era, during Freud's era, sex was really focused on for reproductive purposes, and now we accept it as a critical part of healthy, intimate relationships, right? And so again, we have an evolving acceptance for it based on that social and historical context. And then also, when the categories themselves now have an effect on us, or when the definitions have an effect on us. So we now are influenced by how society is defining and interpreting these concepts. And we definitely see that with the LGBTQ community. We've really grown to a place where there's predominant support for diverse sexual identities, but not as much support for diverse gender identities. And so even though they're all members of the LGBTQ community, there's even a hierarchy within that community such that people who have a cisgender identity but are gay or pansexual or bisexual, they are ranked higher than and receive more social privilege and acceptance than those who might have a transgender identity or a non-binary identity. So, is sexuality genetic? Here's the problem. When we try to study sexuality from a genetic standpoint, in some ways it pathologizes homosexuality. What do we mean by that? It's like, I'm a breast cancer survivor, right? Well, they don't call me survivor because I don't have enough years under my belt, and I'm actually in the middle of the scare right now. So either way, right, when they're trying to find out, is it genetic? Do I have the genetic marker? We typically have that genetic focus because there's something we want to identify to fix, right? We don't need to fix sexuality. Sexuality is not something that we have to identify the genetic marker, and there's a danger in identifying specific genes. Why? Because there are haters in the world, right? There is evil in the world, right? And that doesn't even have to be in a religious context. So if we do identify a gene, what happens if that knowledge and technology falls into the hands of somebody that wants to eradicate homosexual populations? Do they go in and genetically alter and modify embryos to ensure that we don't have any gay children born? Do they sterilize individuals who are gay to make sure that they're not reproducing and increasing the risk of a next generation of gay individuals, right? So there's dangers. We have a history of eugenics in our country, right? In the world. The things that, the horrific atrocities that have been committed, on the Jewish population during the Holocaust, on our African American population during the period of slavery. And most recently, there was forced sterilization upon our immigrants in the detention centers at the border right in California, right? That's recently. That's in the last 5 years these things were happening. And so we have to be mindful that there are very much dangers out there when we do identify a genetic relationship. Behavioral genetics is a field that really looks at the relative contribution of genes in the environment to a particular trait or behavior. And so it can be a mathematical calculation. We're not identifying a specific gene, but what we are doing is comparing we're comparing the incidence of a particular trait among those that are more genetically similar compared to those that aren't, right? And I think I discussed this in the gender section as well, where I talked about fraternal twins over here to the right. They are actually two separate zygotes, two separate fertilized eggs that develop into two separate embryos, two separate fetuses, and are birthed into two separate children with completely individual DNA. And a monozygotic twin starts out with one zygote, one fertilized egg, that in the process of cell division, it accidentally divides into two separate eggs. And then consequently, it develops into two babies that share 100% of the same DNA. So when we see incidence rates shared or increased shared rates of a particular trait more common in identical twins than fraternal twins, that indicates, because both twins shared the same prenatal environment, right? That indicates that it likely has a more genetic link. And so that produces concordance rates, and we do see higher concordance rates among monozygotic twins. So there's higher rates of shared sexually expansive identities among monozygotic twins than there are among dizygotic, than there are among just regular twins. Just regular siblings. Okay, Environmental findings has produced correlational research, right? Not causal, correlational. And the problem with correlational findings is when we're talking about environmental influences, we really don't know, is it the environment itself, right? Or is it the fact that certain environments may be more supportive and therefore conducive to someone exploring their identity and adopting a diverse gender identity because they feel safer to do so. So here's some correlational findings, but you got to keep that confound in mind, right? And a confound is a potential contaminant, right, of our results. It's some third variable that might be systematically altering our results. So we do know that there are higher rates of gay children who have gay parents. So if you just look at families and you look at families with gay parents compared to those with heterosexual parents, there are a higher percentage of children among gay parents that I also identify as gay. Now, does that mean gay parents make gay children? No, it does not. Does that mean, well, they're modeling the gayness and so therefore the children are gay? No. What it could mean is that in a gay household, they have less social pressures to conform to very rigid identities. They see a more loving, inclusive, accepting, supportive environment that encourages everybody to be their authentic self. So they don't have the added social pressures that many individuals who might have inclinations, right? They might, actually have attractions, but they're not acting on those attractions because they have all kinds of social pressures that tell them all these horrible things about gay individuals, right? So there's that potential. We also see that in Denmark, we have a research study that shows that people from urban areas, cities, there's a higher percentage of the population gay that live in urban areas as opposed to suburban. Why? Or rural environments. Why? Well, it could be that the culture is very different in rural areas and rural communities than it is in more of a city life, and in that context they have greater diversity, greater acceptance, greater support, greater tolerance, all those other wonderful things that accept a wider range of behavior, people, traits, qualities, and so that could explain it. Another environment to consider is the prenatal environment, and we definitely know that prenatal environments are exposed to stress, which produces cortisol, which is a hormone, and then other hormones, sex-related hormones, estrogens and progesterones and androgens, can all influence the development of the child. And so we do find that in individuals who, if you just look at the fetal environment and you're looking at measuring testosterone levels, when a female embryo is exposed or fetus is exposed to a higher rate of testosterone, there's a greater percentage or a greater likelihood that that individual is a lesbian. So, female embryos who end up becoming or identifying as lesbian actually have been exposed to higher levels of testosterone. Not all, right? But when they're doing comparative research and looking at the testosterone levels in prenatal environments, that they're showing higher testosterone exposure for individuals that identify as lesbian. There's also some weird research about the distance between the second and the fourth finger, and it's mixed results. One study, I think Watts and Holmes were both in both studies, but Raines, I think, is in the one study, but not the newer study. Some research has shown that lesbians have a different proportion of distance between the two fingers than heterosexual women. But then there was a subsequent study that didn't reproduce those results. So that could be, some weird thing. There's also, that's about science, right? We have to be able to reproduce the results. If we cannot reproduce the results consistently and reliably, then we don't want to give a lot of weight to those findings. Fraternal birth order effect is something that we see with gay males, where biological birth order, so this isn't about having a lot of older adopted brothers. Biologically, if you are the fifth brother as opposed to the first brother, there's actually a higher rate of homosexuality among the younger brothers with lots of older brothers, not sisters, brothers. Maybe that testosterone, repeated testosterone exposure changes something in the uterus of the mother. We don't know. More research is needed to understand that birth order effect. Evolutionary psychology, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is looking at what is the adaptive value. How does this particular behavior or trait support the survival of our species, right? And given that same-sex interaction is non-reproductive, right, it's not going to contribute to producing children, fertilizing eggs, and continuing the species. However, there are other benefits that can come out of it that impact us socially, and that can have adaptive value, right? So it could be that same-sex sexual contact, creates additional bonds, creates that social connection or social glue that then contributes to the survival of the overall society or species continuing. Kin selection, looking at like within a particular family, right, or your chosen family, right, that you might, be able to have healthier offspring introduced to families than you would otherwise. And so maybe, like my sister is in a same-sex marriage and she chose not to have children. And okay, great. So her genes aren't passed down directly, but what she does is she supports me in raising my children, which contributes to the survival of the 4 children that I've produced, right? And so, overall the family, her sexuality actually has benefited the overall family and our survival and thriving. Alliance formation, same as social glue, in that you can form these alliances that provide stronger support systems and mechanisms that contribute to the health and well-being and thriving of other members of the family. There is this practice hypothesis, and I kind of resented. I thought about leaving it out, but instead I decided to acknowledge it and then just acknowledge its flaws. But somehow same-sex activity, like you hear people talk about, they experimented in college, right? Like that experimental phase in same-sex activities helps them develop mature skills for healthy heterosexual relationships down the road. And I don't like that because it kind of reinforces this hierarchy. Like, I'm starting here and practicing so I can elevate and power up to heterosexual, and I kind of don't like that. Sometimes it's a wonderful way, I would say, for identity exploration rather than practice, right? It gives people the opportunity to, figure out who they are, and when we're living our authentic self, we are healthier, we're going to thrive, we're going to build stronger relationships and connections with others. And then finally, the enhanced family fertility hypothesis, which, there might be some genetic variables that we may have not discovered yet, fully identified yet, and that can potentially impact fertility and success in terms of mate selection, and all of that may help contribute to, again, the overall family rather than an individual passing on. Maybe the overall family has higher fertility rates, In terms of looking at history, so Gerda Lerna was a historian that talked about LGBTQ history. How are the LGBTQ individuals, how is that community represented in our history, right? For what's really interesting, particularly from a colonial perspective, when the people in power also are the people who are producing the books, writing the textbooks, developing the curriculum, controlling the educational institutions, they get to decide, what's in the book, who's in the book, and who's not. And so largely the marginalized groups are left out of history. They're not showcased. They're not highlighted. Why? Because that's part of marginalization, right? And history historically has left out the contributions of the LGBTQ community. So how did they respond to that, right? And Lerna suggests that there were 4 stages. First, there was compensation, where they were trying to compensate, similar to how Freud might talk about compensation, where the community would find LGBTQ examples and try to reinsert them because they had been excluded intentionally before. And so they're trying to reinsert them into narratives. And that goes with contribution, because they find LGBTQ community members who have made significant contributions to society, LGBTQ scientists, LGBTQ activists, and they showcase them as members of the community who have made these valuable contributions. Then they also have gone through and they're going back to primary sources, and they're examining it now through a new lens, a new perspective, similar to what I was describing with the comparative research in animal studies. We're doing the same thing in exploring our own historical sources and documents, and trying to reclaim and recapture and refocus attention on those LGBTQ histories. And then also, this actually shows this whole process and the fact that we're re-examining that evidence, kind of like we can go back and look at old cases now with the DNA technology that we have now and see if there's DNA evidence, right? Now that we have advancements in social sciences, we can go back now and reevaluate with our new knowledge, and that might give us different insights and conclusions than we would have otherwise drawn with our limited perspective, right? And so this actually helps to document the nature of social constructionism as it relates to how we are searching for and interpreting LGBTQ histories. Political activism is important for the LGBTQ community. I don't know if you've heard the concept when the tide comes up, all boats rise, right? And so when you talk about civil rights, we've had women's rights, we've had civil rights in terms of, eradicating segregation and allowing equal access for communities of color. We've had civil rights movements for the LGBTQ community. We've had civil rights movements for the diverse abilities community as well, right? So disability advocacy, the disability advocates actually learned from the other groups, and the LGBTQ community was okay, we're going to organize grassroots efforts. The Stonewall riots are said to be one of the most prominent events that inspired political activism for the LGBTQ community. So the Capitol Police raided the Stonewall Inn, and this was known to be an LGBTQ, club. People hung out. Now, it's said that there were some ins, right? And so, as I mentioned, in the LGBTQ community, there's a hierarchy. White gay males tend to be at the top, and then gay men of color tend to fall under them. Your transgender individuals with varying sexual orientations tend to experience more marginalization and oppression. And so there's said to be this conspiring that went on, and the Stonewall some people in the end knew that they were going to get raided, and so they were conveniently not there. And what happened was it ended up targeting your drag and your trans workers. Sylvia Rivera is one of our most famous political activists. She was a trans woman of color, very well respected, brave, change maker, right? Revolutionary for the trans community and LGBTQ community as a whole. And so she, was part of the Stonewall riots, became kind of a symbol of activism for the community, as did Harvey Milk. And the riots, what happened when they were raided is rioting started to break out outside of the inn. Arrests were happening, horrid searches were happening, inappropriate touching was happening, and outside riots started. And those riots continued for a few days. And I know that in recent history, people portray riots as, interestingly enough, they portray riots that might emerge from Black Lives Matter protests as very un-American, but then they portray things like, the charge on the Capitol on January 6th as being totally American. Hypocrisy, absolute hypocrisy, right? America is a country that was built on riots. The Boston Tea Party was, in fact, a riot. And not that I'm condoning rioting, but what I am suggesting is sometimes the social tensions and oppression can become so overwhelming that it breaks the human spirit and pushes us to a point of such contention that rioting breaks out. And that's what happened. So it was the breaking point for the LGBTQ community. The resistance grew. It built community. It built activism. It built grassroots efforts, organizing. Carl Whitman and the academia, writing and drawing light and shedding light and drawing attention to the horrific abuses, and really inspiring and encouraging people to liberate themselves, right? All of that helped. New research focusing on showcasing homosexuality as a normative sexual identity, and you saw that influence the APA to actually take homosexuality out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a disorder. It was originally identified as a disorder, and they officially denounced conversion therapies. Sadly, it still happens. Sadly, people are still stuck in those horrific mindsets. However, you saw this was the birth of the Pride movement. The Pride movement was inspired from the Stonewall riots. So the Pride parades that you go to today actually are looking back on the Stonewall riots. That was the inspiration. That also inspired AIDS advocacy as well. Sadly, the AIDS epidemic came a couple decades later, but that activism and that movement was able to be drawn upon for countering the very hateful narratives and discriminatory actions and legislation that arose from the AIDS epidemic. It was originally identified as a disease among the gay community, and there were active efforts to legislate and restrict their rights and access, almost treating them like lepers. And so, again, those activist groups form, and they have, through that grassroots effort, they lobby, they organize, they actually marched on Washington, and they were able to get Supreme Court legislation that ended up, initially there were some Supreme Court rulings that hurt them, but overall, I think that continuous activism, that momentum from the Stonewall riots continued and helped the LGBTQ community organize in such a way that, they have a really strong advocacy and activism that led to the Supreme Court legalizing same-sex marriage. We're going a little bit backwards right now in American society. We are seeing legislation that is undermining the rights of our LGBTQ community, particularly our transgender communities being attacked. So there's still much work to be done, but we can draw upon the history and successes of our predecessors and continue to plow forward in our resistance. I do think it's important that your book talks about hate crimes. Two of the most famous kind of mass shootings that targeted the LGBTQ community are the Upstairs Lounge attack and the Pulse nightclub attack. And they, in some communities, they still have anniversaries of the lives that were lost there. And it's important to note that these aren't just historical. Transgender women of color are more likely to be assaulted than any other racial and ethnic group in American society. And so it's very important that we continue to stay vigilant in protecting this community. Their lives literally depend on it. Matthew Shepard was, to the LGBTQ community, he became a symbol of anti-gay violence, right? Like we know George Floyd today became a symbol of police brutality against the Black community. That's what Matthew Shepard was to the gay community. Now, he was a white, affluent, gay male. And so that spurred a lot of outreach and eventually led to legislation to protect the gay community and to provide a hate crime provision for people who assault and attack individuals because of their sexuality or their gender identity. And that's really important. But I'm also mindful that we don't always find such responsiveness when it's a person of color and who is victimized. And so we do need to use that as an opportunity to examine ourselves and our social systems and where there's opportunity for continued growth. And then your book talks about how coming out was really encouraged, particularly during this time. The gay liberation movement from the 70s, all of this activism really led to kind of a public calling for people to come out. Harvey Milk became one of the wonderful faces of this liberation movement. Again, a white male. There's a wonderful movie about him portrayed by Sean Penn. But I do want to caution you. It's a very individual decision. Consider your circumstances. Consider your safety. In some situations, you may not be safe if you come out. And only you know that. Emotionally safe, physically safe, spiritually safe. You have to assess those risks and those benefits. Make sure you have a social support network. Make sure you have community there, and seek out resources that can help you, support you, and again, most importantly, keep you safe. And then as we wrap up, I just want to share some words of wisdom from Harvey Milk. Hope will never be silent. Find a way, even if you're not fully out in all spaces, find a way to use your voice. Find a way to liberate yourself, even if you're having to do it without being formally out. Sylvia Rivera leaves us with, we have to do it because we can no longer stay invisible. We have to be visible. We should not be ashamed of who we are. We have to show the world that we are numerous. There are many of us out there. So I would say those of you that are in a privileged position where your safety is not compromised, be the visibility for those that don't have the liberty to be publicly out. Be the voice for those that may need to be silent at this season of their lives. For those that have privilege, use that privilege to advocate for the rights, safety, and needs of those that don't. And with that, I'm going to wish you love and aloha. And I'm just going to remind you, as you're wrapping up your chapter, make sure you're taking detailed notes of your reading, detailed notes of your lecture, and then submit those through your learning management system, and make sure you're including those proposed test questions as well. And then I will make sure I have a wonderful learning activity for you focused on advocacy in the community, gender and sexual advocacy to empower and liberate our LGBTQ community. Much love and aloha to all of you. Bye-bye.